Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 19 stories for you, including the translation of the Salt Hum, the graduate of room 402, the Shimmer of the Manor, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The translation of the Salt Hum. I am writing these notes for a scholar who values the literal over the lyrical, yet I must confess that the following passage remains stubborn. The protagonist, a solitary traveler navigating the Great Salt Flats after the sun has surrendered to the indigo void, encountered something that defies linguistic capture. It is an entity of presence rather than form, and I apologize in advance for the fact that the final movement of its arrival refuses to be translated into any human tongue. It began on the third night of the trek. The Salt Flat was a white desert of cracked polygons, stretching toward an horizon where the ground and sky bled into one another. There was no wind, only the oppressive weight of silence. I sat in my small tent, the canvas walls vibrating slightly from the temperature drop. That is when I first heard it, a low, resonant hum. It did not come from outside. It originated within the marrow of my bones. It was a frequency that matched my pulse exactly, thump hum, thump hum. At first, I thought it was a trick of the ears, a phantom resonance caused by my own blood moving through my veins. But as the hours ticked by, the hum began to change. It felt intentional. The entity wasn't just mimicking my heartbeat, it was teaching itself how to race. It started slow, a rhythmic thrum that pulsed with the steady pace of a resting heart. Then, with a sudden, deliberate urgency, the hum accelerated. My own heart responded in sympathy, jumping from a calm 60 beats per minute to a frantic gallop without any physical exertion on my part. It was then that I noticed the first damp handprint on the canvas of the tent flap. It wasn't a smear of mud or a drop of rain. It was a clear, moist impression of a palm and 4 distinct fingers. They appeared as if something had reached out from the empty air and pressed against the fabric to feel my warmth. I sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement would break the connection. The hum grew louder, vibrating in my teeth. It was no longer just a sound. It felt like a physical pressure, a weight pushing inward. On the glass of my lantern, another handprint appeared. This one was slightly higher than the first. Then another, and another. They weren't coming from the outside. They were appearing on the interior side of the glass, as if the entity were standing inside my head, pressing its palms against the boundaries of my perception. I realized then that it had no body in the traditional sense, no skin to catch the light, no hair to flow in a breeze. It was a creature of vibration and moisture. As the hum reached a fever pitch, my heart began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped moth. The pace was blistering now, a rapid-fire staccato that made my vision blur. Every time my pulse spiked, a new damp print would bloom on the glass. They were becoming more frantic, the moisture of each palm spreading slightly as if it were slowly evaporating. I tried to speak, but my voice felt heavy in the salt air. "Are you here?" I whispered. The hum didn't pause. It simply adjusted its pitch to match the curve of my question. In response, a flurry of prints appeared on the lantern glass, coming so fast they blurred into a continuous smear of wetness. It was as if the entity were trying to hold on to me, to anchor itself to my rhythm. Then came the moment that defies translation. The hum stopped abruptly. My heart, still racing at its peak velocity, hung in a state of suspended animation for one heartbeat, and then crashed into a heavy silence. In that vacuum of sound, the prints vanished. I reached out to touch the lantern glass where the moisture had been, expecting to feel a lingering dew. Instead, my fingers met something solid. It wasn't a smudge. The texture was smooth, yet it felt like velvet submerged in water. When I pulled my hand back, the surface of the glass remained perfectly clear and dry. I sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the silence of the salt flats. My heart eventually slowed, returning to its natural, sluggish crawl. But as I prepared to sleep, I felt a sudden, sharp pressure against my cheek, a single, damp touch from a palm that had no body to hold it. I realized then that while the hum had finished its lesson, the entity hadn't left. It was simply waiting for my heart to start racing again so it could join the race. The graduate of room 402. Good evening, class. Please find your seats, though I know some of you are still drifting in the aisles, and some of you have already begun to merge with the shadows of the rafters. Do not be alarmed by the empty chairs. In this lecture hall, an absence is just as profound as a presence. Today marks your final day. You have endured the curriculum of the Mindmender Asylum, and tonight I shall deliver your graduation address from the vantage point of my own station. I am standing here at the head of the room, holding a lantern that casts a rhythmic amber glow over your weary faces. It is nearly midnight, and the air smells of old wax and medicinal herbs. For months, you have been patients in this wing, tucked into beds with heavy quilts, watching me move through the corridors during my rounds. You were the ones who asked what it was like to see them, the entities that inhabit the spaces between your thoughts. Tonight, I want to show you something special. On the far wall of our classroom, there is a floating pane of glass. It is not a window into the outside world, but a live stream of my own bedroom, located 3 floors above this hall. It is strange, isn't it? The angle of the camera in that room shouldn't be possible from your perspective. It sits perfectly level with the floor, yet it captures the ceiling and the corner of the bed as if the viewer were hovering directly over a single point, looking down at a world tilted on its side. As you watch the stream, observe my bed. It is empty, save for the pillow. Yet, every time I blink, the lantern light flickers and something changes in that distant room. You see the way the quilt ripples even when there is no wind. You hear the soft thud of a weight shifting on the mattress. And then, you see it, the static charge. It does not have a face to speak of, nor a body made of solid meat. It is a hovering pulse of electricity and velvet texture. When it enters my room, the air hums with a low, vibrating frequency that makes your teeth ache. It moves with a stuttering grace, like a film reel skipping a frame every few seconds. It doesn't walk, it ripples through the space, pulling the atmosphere toward itself. Watch closely as the static charge approaches the center of my bed. It is not a ghost, but a gathering of energy. When it reaches for me in that room, it doesn't use limbs. Instead, it radiates a sudden, sharp pull. My hair and your own hairs on your arms begin to stand upright. They don't just rise, they're sculpted by the entity's invisible grip. It leaves behind a perfect physical print of its presence, a wide, spread hand of static that stays frozen in the air like an impression in wet clay. You can see the individual fingers of electricity reaching out, each one tipped with a tiny spark that dances against the fabric of my sheets. I spent years trying to catch it, to pin it down with nets or jars, but it is too elusive for cages. It simply exists in the corner of the room, waiting for the moment I am not looking. But tonight, in this live stream, we see it clearly because it knows we are watching. The charge is growing stronger now. The hum is becoming a roar in your ears. In the stream, the static hand reaches out and touches the edge of the frame, as if trying to break through the glass and join us here in the hall. I can feel it reaching for me now, even though I am standing right here before you. My hair is beginning to rise toward the ceiling, reacting to its proximity from 3 floors above. The temperature in this room is dropping, and the lantern flame is turning a strange, bruised shade of violet. You are all leaning forward, your faces illuminated by that flickering light. Look at the very edge of the live stream one last time. Do you see how the static hand has finally touched the glass? It hasn't just pressed against it, it has begun to smudge the surface from the inside out. The print is widening. It is no longer a shape in my room, it is becoming a doorway. I have finished my address and your journey through this. Asylum is complete. You are ready to leave these walls behind. But as you walk toward the exit, remember the lesson of room 402. We think we are the ones observing the world, but sometimes the world is simply reaching out to touch us. The shimmer of the manor. Sit closer, little one. I know you want to hear that the girl found her way home and slept safely in a warm bed, but the truth is often more delicious when it tastes of salt and shadow. Let me tell you about Alara and the requisitioned manor of Blackwood. During the Great Relocation, Alara was sent to live alone in that sprawling stone beast for 3 months. It was a house of high ceilings and heavy velvet curtains, smelling of old wax and memories that didn't belong to her. For the first week, she lived in a state of peaceful solitude, enjoying the way the sunlight carved patterns on the floorboards. But then, the wind began to change. It wasn't a physical breeze that moved the dust, it was a voice. Every time Alara stepped out into the courtyard or onto the wide stone balcony alone, the wind would catch her name. It didn't just whisper Alara, it breathed it with a rhythmic, pulsing cadence. Ilare. Sometimes it was soft, like a secret shared between friends. Other times, it was sharp, as if the air itself were trying to puncture her skin. She started to notice that the wind only spoke when she was isolated. Inside the house, surrounded by furniture and shadows, there was silence. Outside, in the open expanse of the garden, the wind became her constant companion, calling her from the corners of the lawn as if someone, or something, were standing just beyond her periphery. She began to feel a strange pressure in the air, a sense that she was being watched by an invisible audience. Then came the afternoon of the Great Frost. Alara stood in the center of the courtyard, the ground crusted with white lace. The wind howled, spinning around her like a dancer, and it shouted her name with such force that her hair whipped across her face. Alara. It sounded less like air moving and more like a throat opening. That was when she saw it for the first time. At the edge of the fountain stood a ripple in the air. It wasn't a solid shape, but a heat shimmer, a distortion of reality that looked like the haze rising from a hot road on a summer day. It hung there, perfectly motionless, suspended in the frigid air like a held breath. It had no face and no limbs. It was a wobbling, translucent orb of gold and amber light. It didn't move toward her at first. It simply existed, shimmering with an internal vibration that made the grass around it curl. But as Alara stood frozen, the shimmer began to expand. It didn't glide, it stretched. The edges of the heat shimmer smoothed out, becoming more defined until it looked like a crown of liquid honey suspended in midair. Then, with a sudden, violent grace, the shimmer lunged forward. It didn't strike her like a fist. It flowed around her right wrist like molten wax cooling into a mold. The moment it touched her skin, Alara felt a sensation of profound weight. It wasn't heavy like stone, but heavy like deep water. The shimmer clamped down on her arm, its boundaries vibrating against her pulse. She could feel its texture. It was smooth and slightly tacky, like the surface of a soap bubble that refused to pop. For 3 minutes, she stood in total silence as the shimmer held her wrist in its golden grip. It wasn't just holding her, it seemed to be tasting her. The air around her arm began to hum, a low frequency that vibrated in her teeth. She tried to pull back, but the shimmer was stubborn, anchoring her to the spot. Then, as quickly as it had arrived, the heat shimmer relaxed its hold. It didn't vanish, it simply retreated, pulling back into itself until it became a tiny, glowing spark at her elbow. The wind died instantly, leaving a silence so profound she could hear her own heartbeat. Alara breathed out, relieved to be free of the golden weight. She turned toward the manor door, ready to run inside and find her sanctuary. But as she stepped forward, she felt a faint, lingering warmth on her skin. She looked down at her wrist and saw that where the shimmer had held her, a perfect, glowing circle remained, faintly pulsing with light. She realized then that the shimmer hadn't just visited her, it had marked her. As she reached for the heavy oak door of the manor, she heard a tiny, muffled sound from the courtyard behind her, the sound of something soft and warm settling into the grass. The wind began to rise again, but this time, it didn't speak her name. It let out a long, satisfied sigh, as if it were waiting for her to move again so it could have another taste. The guest in the dust. The garage smelled of old motor oil and the dry, papery scent of cardboard boxes. It was the night before the estate sale, that transitional period where a house stops being a home and starts becoming a collection of objects waiting to be owned by strangers. I sat on a crate of mismatched mugs, my phone held in one hand as I recorded a voice memo to capture the atmosphere. My grandmother had left me this garage full of her life's clutter, and I needed to document the feeling of sorting through it. The air was heavy, thick with the dust of 40 years, but it was remarkably quiet until I heard the first hum. It wasn't a sound, exactly, it was a vibration in my teeth. Then came the voice. It was low, melodic, and felt as though it were coming from the rafters rather than my own throat. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, the voice whispered. It was a perfect nursery rhyme, but the timbre of the voice belonged to a woman who hadn't spoken in hours. I looked up into the shadows of the ceiling beams. There was no one there, just more boxes of lace and iron. I spoke into my phone, my own voice sounding small against the vastness of the rafters. "Who's there?" I asked. The response came instantly from the corner where a stack of chairs Saturday, twinkle, twinkle, little star, it murmured. It was her grandmother's favorite rhyme, but as I listened to the transcription on my screen, the app struggled with the entity's peculiar way of speaking. Every time it said star, the app transcribed it as scar. My heart gave a small thrum of unease. I stood up, the floorboards groaning beneath my sneakers. The garage felt larger now, the shadows stretching toward me like reaching arms. From behind a stack of old suitcases, a figure emerged. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It was a house guest that had arrived without an invitation. It looked exactly like me, the same messy brown hair, the same slight crook in my nose, even the same birthmark on my left chin. However, there were subtle differences. Its skin had the texture of fine hammered copper, and its hair didn't fall in strands, but seemed to float as if underwater. But the most striking thing was its eyes. They weren't pupils at all, but swirling marbles of amber that moved independently of one another. It sat on a stool, mimicking my posture perfectly. "Jack and Jill went up the hill," it said, its voice vibrating with a slight metallic resonance. The app recorded, "Jack and Jill went up the scar." I felt a chill prickle my neck. It wasn't just a twin, it was a version of me that had been filtered through a different reality. It reached out a hand, its skin gleaming like a dull penny, and touched a box. "Little boy blue, lost his shoes," it crooned. The app chirped, "Little boy blue, lost his shoes." This time, the transcription was perfect. I realized then that while the entity mimicked my face and body, it didn't quite understand the concept of a star. To this creature, every light in the sky was a mark, a healing over a wound. It stood up and began to pace the perimeter of the garage, its movements fluid and silent. Each time it spoke a rhyme, it seemed to get closer, its copper skin catching the dim light of the hanging bulb. "1, 2, buckle my shoe," it whispered near my ear. The app read, 1, 2, buckle my shoe. It was perfectly consistent here. I realized that only the very first word of the rhyme changed for this creature. For everything else, it understood our world perfectly. But for star, it saw a scar. The entity stopped in front of me and leaned in until its amber marbles were inches from my own eyes. It took a deep breath, as if preparing for a final performance. It didn't look like a twin anymore. It looked like a mirror that was slightly distorted. "Hey diddle, diddle, the cat and the fiddle," it began. The app recorded, "Hey diddle, diddle, the cat and the fiddle." My breath hitched. For once, there was no mistake. It had finished the rhyme, its copper skin glowing with a faint, internal warmth. Then it leaned in even closer, its mouth barely moving, and whispered the final line of the very first rhyme it had spoken when I entered. "Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall," it said clearly. The app recorded, "Humpty Dumpty sat on a scar." As the word registered, the entity didn't move, but its amber eyes widened until they nearly touched. It wasn't sitting on a wall anymore. It was resting on the wound of the world we were currently inhabiting. The frequency of the fold. Log entry, depth 0. Bearing, north-northwest. The cabin is a ribcage of timber against the white expanse, and I am its only heartbeat. Outside, the snow does not fall so much as it colonizes the world, erasing the pines until only the jagged peaks remain visible. Inside, the fire is a dying amber eye. I came here to escape the noise of the city, but the silence of the mountain has a weight to it, a pressure against my eardrums that suggests something is listening back. Log entry, depth 12. Bearing, east. The first sound began an hour ago, not a thud or a creak, but a hum. It was the sound of a radio station tuned between two worlds, a wet static that seemed to drip from the ceiling like condensation. It wasn't just noise, it had texture. It felt like velvet soaked in oil, bubbling and popping in the corners of the room. Then came the voice. It didn't speak with lungs or vocal cords, it spoke with vibrations. We grew up side by more side, it whispered into my left ear. The static surged, a ripple of white noise that made the hair on my arms stand upright. I turned, but there was nothing there but the dancing shadows of the hearth. Log entry, depth 24. Bearing, south-southwest. It appeared in the doorway, a shivering mass of gray and charcoal fuzz. It had no solid bones. Its body was a shifting landscape of wet static, looking as though it were made of television snow caught in a rainstorm. Instead of a face, it possessed a flickering surface where features constantly rearranged themselves like melting wax. From its core, the rhythmic pulse of a half-heard dial tone emanated, a constant brawling that seemed to fluctuate in pitch depending on how close it drifted to me. We grew up side by side, it repeated. The sound was layered, as if 3 people were speaking at once, each slightly out of sync. It moved with a jerky, frame-skipping motion, teleporting an inch forward every few seconds rather than gliding. Log entry, depth 40. Bearing, west. I tried to explain my confusion. I have never seen you before, I told the static. The entity rippled, its surface bubbling into a series of frantic pops. It drifted closer, the dial tone deepening until it vibrated in my chest cavity. But we played in the tall grass together, it hummed. Its shape expanded, becoming more defined. Small droplets of moisture, heavy with electricity, leaked from its edges and hit the floor with a soft tink. It didn't have hands, but rather trailing ends of fuzz that swayed like sea anemones in a current. Log entry, depth 60. Bearing, north. The storm outside intensified, hammering against the logs, but the entity was focused entirely on me. It began to circle the chair where I sat. Every time it passed, the room smelled of ozone and old copper. Its dial tone became a frantic, weeping melody, climbing in frequency until it reached a sharp, piercing whine. You remember the creek? We jumped into it together, it stated. It was leaning toward me now, its static face swirling with intensity. A small portion of it stretched out, a protrusion of dense noise that mimicked the shape of a limb but lacked any permanence. Log entry, depth 85. Bearing, southeast. I realized then that it wasn't just mimicking memories, it was claiming them. It was pulling my past into its own fuzzy architecture. Every time it spoke, the wet static pulsed with a new color of gray, and the dial tone skipped like a scratched record. We shared the same bread, it whispered, its voice now a low, resonant thrum. The cabin felt smaller as it grew larger, filling the space until I could barely see the walls. It was no longer a guest, it was an atmospheric pressure of history. Log entry, depth 100. Bearing, true north. The entity lunged forward, its static body enveloping my head like a warm, damp veil. For a moment, there was no sound but the overwhelming hum of the dial tone, the sound of a connection being made across a vast distance. I felt its texture against my skin, grainy and humid, the sensation of 1,000 tiny sparks dancing over my brow. We grew up side by side. It finally cried out, the voice no longer echoing in the room, but inside my own skull. The static smoothed out, becoming perfectly still, as if the noise had finally found its destination. Log entry, depth 0. Bearing, null. The fire is out. The snow has buried the windows. I am sitting in the chair, and the entity is no longer moving. It has settled into my shadow, a permanent smudge of wet static on the floor. I can still hear it, even when it doesn't speak, the faint, ghostly ring of a dial tone that never ends, calling for a number that hasn't been dialed yet. The gap in the nursery. The nursery was a room of contradictions, a sanctuary caught between 2 eras. The bottom half of the walls were covered in fresh, cream-colored paint that felt smooth to the touch, while the top half remained the original wood dark, honeyed oak with visible grain and small knots. It sat at the far end of the house, a century-old structure where the floorboards groaned under the weight of history. I had moved in during the autumn, seeking a quiet life, but the nursery was always the coldest room. It felt as though the air there didn't just sit, it pooled like water in a basin, thick and slightly heavy with an unseen moisture. One Tuesday evening, while the rain tapped a rhythmic beat against the glass, I sat in the rocking chair and watched my toddler sleep in the crib. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by his soft breathing and the occasional, tiny twitch of his fingers. Outside, the world was draped in shades of charcoal and slate. Inside, the nursery felt like a bubble of safety. Then I heard it, a voice that didn't seem to come from my own throat or the shadows of the corner. It was a lullaby, but the notes were stretched thin, like a violin string pulled to its breaking point. "Sleep now, little seed," the voice hummed, followed by "The moon is a cradle." Usually, a lullaby follows a logical progression, but these lines were swapped, drifting into one another in a jumbled, dreamy sequence. I looked toward the window, expecting to see the swaying branches of the willow tree, but something else caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shimmering distortion in the air, like heat rising from asphalt. But as I watched, the distortion moved. It was a woman-shaped gap in the world. She wasn't a physical being made of flesh. She was a void, a hole in reality through which the background scenery seemed to fold and warp. The edges of her silhouette were fringed with a soft, iridescent blur where light bent inward toward her center. She was massive. Her head alone was the size of my dining table, and her torso stretched upward until her shoulders reached the height of the roofline. As she drifted past the window, the house seemed to groan as if reacting to her immense weight, a low timber creak that resonated in the floorboards beneath my feet. She didn't walk, she glided, a slow-motion parade of absence. I watched the way the moonlight curved around her hip, making the distant garden fence appear to bow inward toward her body, as if she were an invisible magnet pulling at the very fabric of the yard. The lullaby continued, the verses tumbling out in their broken order. "The cradle is full, then sleep now, little seed." The voice was resonant, vibrating in my chest like a deep cello note, making the hair on my arms stand on end. As she moved further across the yard, I realized she wasn't just passing by, she was consuming the space around her. Where she touched the air, the colors of the garden became more vivid for a second. The grass turned a brilliant emerald and the roses a deep ruby, before fading into a duller hue as she passed. I found myself leaning forward, my hands gripping the armrests of the chair. I felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the window, a desire to step out and touch her, yet a primal fear kept me anchored to the floor. It was as if the sheer scale of her presence might crush the room if I moved too quickly. She took nearly an hour to drift from the front gate to the back porch, a steady, majestic migration of emptiness. The house felt smaller when she was near, compressed by her magnitude. When she finally reached the far corner of the garden, her hand, a wide, sweeping arc of warped space, brushed against the glass of the nursery window. The pane didn't rattle. It hummed with a low-frequency vibration that made my teeth ache slightly. She lingered there for a moment, a giant silhouette of not there, before continuing her journey into the deep woods beyond. When she finally vanished from view, the house fell into an absolute ringing silence, as if the world had taken a collective breath. I sat in the dark for a long time, watching the cream paint on the wall where the light had just been bent by her passing. My son woke up then and reached out his tiny hand toward the glass, grasping at the empty space where she had been. "Mama," he whispered, his eyes wide with an instinctual recognition of the vastness outside. I leaned over him and whispered back, "She's still out there." But as I looked back at the window, I noticed a single, lingering ripple in the air, like a stone thrown into a pond, refusing to smooth out completely. The persistence of the flash. Redacted Field Report. Observation 74B. Subject: the glacial stalker. The ice does not forgive silence, and at last light, it begins to speak in cracks. I stood alone in the center of the crevasse field, where the glacier exhaled a biting, crystalline breath. Everything was blue, the deep, bruised indigo of the shadows and the pale sapphire of the frozen ridges. The wind had died down to a whisper, leaving only the groaning of the ice shifting under its own immense weight. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy on the eardrums, like being underwater in a cathedral of frost. I took out my camera, a heavy brass-bound beast of a thing, and prepared for the documentation. The shadows were stretching now, pulling the edges of the world toward the center of the crevasses. I wanted to capture the exact moment the light surrendered to the dark. I raised the device, framed the jagged tooth of an ice wall, and pressed the shutter. Redacted, the flash was a violent explosion of white against the indigo. It lasted for a fraction of a second, illuminating every grain of frost and every fracture in the deep blue gloom. In that instant, something happened. I didn't see it move. It was too fast for the human eye to track, but when the afterimage settled on my retinas, there was a presence. It wasn't just a light. It was a silhouette burned into the very fabric of my vision. It appeared at the edge of a deep fissure about 20 paces away. It didn't have the typical features of a ghost. Its torso was wide and blocky, like a weathered boulder, but its limbs were segmented like those of an insect, jointed with smooth, pearl-like spheres. Instead of hair, it had a crown of stiff, crystalline needles that hummed in the wind. But it was the face, or what passed for one, that stayed with me. It possessed no mouth or nose, only 3 horizontal slits that glowed with a dim, amber luminescence. Redacted, I blinked, and it was gone. The crevasse was empty again. But as I turned to pack my gear, the sensation of being watched intensified. It wasn't just in front of me anymore. It felt as though it had moved into the periphery. When I looked directly at a rock, it was there, hovering just behind my shoulder. Its body was textured like hammered copper, and its 3 glowing slits pulsed in rhythm with my own heartbeat. Is someone there? I whispered to the ice. The answer didn't come in sound. Instead, the amber slits widened slightly, and a low vibration rattled my teeth. It moved closer, not by walking, but by folding its segmented limbs into itself, collapsing inward like an accordion until it was mere inches from my face. I could smell it now, a scent of ozone and old parchment. Redacted, I reached out to touch the copper surface of its chest, but as my hand drew near, the figure reacted. It didn't flinch, it simply expanded. The crystalline needles on its head flared outward like a blooming flower. Then, with a sudden, fluid motion, it pulled back into the shadows of the largest crevasse. I felt a surge of adrenaline, that sharp prickle of fear that makes the lungs feel small. Don't move, I told myself. I watched the fissure for what felt like minutes. The amber light was fading, retreating into the cracks. I realized then that it wasn't just moving through the space, it was merging with the environment. It became part of the ice, a hidden secret waiting for the next spark of awareness. Redacted, I decided to make my way back toward the base camp, my boots crunching on the frozen crust. The glacier felt different now, no longer a landscape of stone and water, but a gallery of shadows. Every time I turned my head, I saw a flicker of copper, a needle-like twitch of light. It was no longer just a figure in the distance, it was a constant companion. I reached the edge of the field where the flat snow began. I took one last look back at the deep indigo cracks. The amber glow was almost gone, reduced to a tiny spark buried in the heart of the ice. It seemed to be settling in, claiming its territory. Redacted, I reached my tent and collapsed onto my sleeping bag, exhausted by the sensory overload of the day. I closed my eyes to let the darkness wash over me. The world vanished into a void of velvet black. But then, in the absolute stillness of my eyelids, it appeared again. It didn't need the flash anymore. It sat there, perfectly still, right in the center of my inner vision. I felt its presence, heavy and solid as a mountain. It wasn't waiting for me to open my eyes, it was simply waiting for them to stay shut. I realized then that when I had closed my eyes, it hadn't moved back into the crevasse. It had moved inside. The Precursor's wake. Flight 402 is currently experiencing a minor electrical malfunction. Please remain seated as we enter the night phase. The pilot's voice was muffled, almost swallowed by the hum of the engines. I leaned my head against the cool plastic of the window seat. It was a red-eye from London to New York, and by 2 a.m., the cabin lights had flickered once and died completely. We were suspended in a vacuum of indigo shadows, illuminated only by the faint, rhythmic pulse of the wingtip lights. It is strange how the darkness feels heavier when you are moving at 500 miles per hour. I can barely see my own hands. My left shoulder has that peculiar birthmark, the one that looks like a cluster of jagged islands. It's been there since I was a child, a constant companion on my skin. The silence is beginning to stretch. Every time the plane hits a pocket of turbulence, I hear something in the aisle. It isn't a passenger shifting in their seat. It's a soft, rhythmic scraping, like a fingernail tracing the carpet. And then there is the man in 14B. He hasn't moved for an hour. He sits perfectly still, his chin resting on his chest. But his shadow, it isn't behaving normally. I just looked at the man in 14B again. His body is stationary, yet his shadow is moving independently on the cabin wall. It looks like a tall, jagged silhouette with shoulders that hunch upward like a pulled blanket. The most unsettling part is the timing. When he finally lifts his head, his shadow has already been looking at me for 3 full seconds. He is a follower. His shadow is the leader. The birthmark on my shoulder started to twitch. It isn't just skin anymore. It feels like something underneath is crawling. The jagged islands are smoothing out, merging into curves. I can feel the heat of it rising. If I squint, the edges are beginning to form letters. It happened during a lull in the engine roar. I looked down and gasped. The birthmark has completely rearranged itself. It is no longer a cluster of islands. It has formed the word hush. The letters are crisp, written in a deep maroon hue that seems to pulse with every heartbeat. The man in 14B finally moved. He didn't just lift his head, he leaned forward toward me. His shadow did it first. It stretched out across the aisle, its jagged shoulders reaching for my face before his actual head even cleared his chest. He has a peculiar face, with a nose like a blunt pebble and skin that looks like weathered parchment. When he spoke, his voice sounded like 2 stones grinding together. He whispered to me in the dark. "Don't let it finish," he said. His shadow was already pointing at my shoulder when his lips moved. The word on my shoulder is changing again. The H is melting into an A. The birthmark is expanding, stretching across my collarbone like a growing vine. It feels heavy now, as if the word has weight. I can hear a faint humming coming from the skin itself, a low, vibrating drone that resonates in my teeth. The man in 14B stood up. He didn't walk, he glided, his shadow preceding him by 2 full strides. Every time he took a step, his silhouette hit the floor first, creating a soft thud before his feet followed. His shadow has more detail now. I can see what looks like small, vestigial wings on its elbows. He reached out a hand toward my shoulder. The birthmark flared with a sudden, blinding white light. It finished its transformation. It no longer says hush. It now reads run. But as I watched the letters settle, the man's shadow touched my skin before his hand did. The lights didn't come back on when he touched me. Instead, the cabin groaned. The birthmark wasn't just a word anymore. It was a gateway. A tiny ripple appeared in the center of the U, and something small poked its head out, a sliver of a face that looked like mine, but with 3 pupils. The man in 14B sat back down, his expression one of profound relief. His shadow remained standing, looming over me, its jagged shoulders drooping as if it were exhaling. The word run began to crack, the letters splintering into dust. I realized then that he wasn't a passenger who had found me. He was the guardian of what lived inside my skin. He waited for the birthmark to speak so that I could finally let it out. Now, as we approach our destination, I can feel the tiny face on my shoulder blinking. The man in 14B closed his eyes and disappeared into the seat, becoming a mere silhouette of himself. But the birthmark stayed. It shifted one last time, the letters rearranging into a final, desperate command. Mine. I looked at my shoulder and realized the tiny face was no longer just poking out. It was pulling my skin outward, claiming its territory. The plane touched down with a jolt, but as I stepped into the aisle, I felt a cold tug on my collarbone. The little face had opened its mouth wide, revealing rows of teeth that matched my own perfectly. The cue of the unfinished. I am sitting in a folding chair, the fluorescent light overhead humming with a low-frequency buzz that vibrates in my teeth. The interviewer's pen scratches against the paper as I complete the final exit interview for my shift as a night watchman at the Grandview Mall. They asked me to describe the most unsettling part of the 3rd month. I stared at the blank space on the page and thought of the loading dock, that vast concrete expanse where the delivery trucks used to roar. It was there, in the silence between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., that the line first appeared. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, a row of silhouettes standing against the corrugated metal walls. But as I walked toward them with my heavy flashlight, I realized they were tangible. They were people, about 20 of them, spaced perfectly apart in a straight line. They weren't moving. They weren't whispering. They were simply waiting. Every night, the line grew by 3 more people, and every night, I found myself standing at the very back, my own body instinctively joining the queue without me even realizing it had happened. The people in the line were peculiar. They didn't look like any crowd you'd see on a Saturday afternoon. They were blurred around the edges, as if their bodies hadn't quite decided where to end and the air began. One woman in the middle of the line had hair that seemed to fray into threads of static, each strand vibrating slightly. A man near the front had shoulders that were perfectly sharp, like a cut diamond, while his waist was still rounded and soft. They weren't just standing there. They were existing in a state of perpetual becoming. I spent my first week trying to talk to them, but their faces were difficult to read. Their features weren't fixed. A nose might be a sharp point one moment, and then smudge into a smooth curve the next. When I finally gathered the courage to speak to the woman with the static hair, she didn't turn her head. Instead, her face rippled like water in a pond as she spoke. "Is it time yet?" she asked, her voice sounding like 2 stones grinding together underwater. The line moved forward by a single inch. I felt my own heels click against the concrete. There was no visible destination, no podium, and no herald to announce their arrival. They were just waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet. By the second month, the atmosphere changed. The air in the loading dock grew heavy, smelling of ozone and old paper. The line began to move with a rhythmic pulse. Every 10 minutes, everyone would lean forward simultaneously, then recoil as if pushed by an invisible hand. They were reacting to something just beyond our perception. I started to notice that the closer you got to the front of the line, the more unresolved you became. The man at the very front was barely a person anymore. His torso was a blocky prism of flesh, and his head was a series of overlapping cubes. He was almost fully rendered into geometry, while I, standing at the back, still felt quite solid and human. One night, the humming of the mall's ventilation stopped completely. The silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight on my shoulders. Then, the thing they were waiting for finally manifested. It didn't walk out from behind a crate or drop from the ceiling. It simply blinked into existence at the front of the line. It was a massive, towering shape that looked like a jagged sculpture made of melting wax. It had no clear face, but it possessed 1,000 tiny, glowing apertures across its surface, each one pulsing with a soft, amber light. As it appeared, the entire line surged forward in a synchronized wave of motion. The static-haired woman reached the front and merged into the entity's side, her hair instantly turning into solid wax. One by one, the people moved forward. They didn't walk, they flowed like honey toward the glowing shape. When it was my turn to reach the front, I felt my own skin begin to itch and stretch. My fingers started to square off, losing their rounded tips. My face began to lose its definition, blurring into a series of smooth planes. As I stepped into the entity's reach, the amber lights flared with blinding intensity. I felt myself being pulled into the mass, my edges finally snapping into place, my body becoming part of the unfinished sculpture. The interviewer asked me what happened to me at the end. I told them that I am no longer a man standing in a loading dock. I am one of the blocks in the masterpiece. But as I sat here writing this final report, I realized something terrifying about the entity's purpose. It wasn't just collecting people to show them off. It was consuming their unfinishedness. Every time someone merged with it, they lost the ability to change. They became permanent. The very last thing I felt before my body fully resolved was a sensation of immense weight pressing down on me from above, as if something even larger than the entity was still waiting to be finished. The provenance of the growing void. I have spent my life cataloging the remnants of the dead, but few objects possess a pedigree as unsettling as the submersible of the sinking orchard. To the casual observer, it is merely an antique research vessel, currently anchored in the crushing silence of the Hadal Zone. Yet, for the collector who actually owns it, it is a living chronicle of patience and encroaching hunger. I am that owner, and here is my provenance note on why this vessel remains on display alone, in a room with no windows. It began during the 3rd year of our isolation. The submersible was a cramped sanctuary of brass and reinforced glass, designed for 4 humans, but inhabited by only one, Dr. Eris Thorne. He didn't just study the seafloor, he lived within it. In the center of his sleeping berth sat a single, framed photograph of a human family standing before a crooked orchard. It was a simple thing of sepia tones and stiff smiles until the 1st year passed. Then came the roots. They did not emerge from the soil of the seabed, but from the very walls of the cabin. They were pale, fibrous things, like translucent veins of ivory. Every year, they stretched toward Dr. Thorne's cot with a rhythmic, pulsing growth. He would wake to find them thicker, weaving a web of woody lace around his head. By the 2nd year, they were thick enough to brush against his skin as he slept, humming with a low frequency that vibrated in his teeth. But the true terror lay within the photograph. In the center of the family portrait, where the father's face should have been, there was a hole. It wasn't a tear in the paper, it was a literal puncture in reality. When Dr. Thorne first noticed it, it was no larger than a copper coin. It radiated a constant, gentle heat, like a stone left in the sun. He would press his palm against it and feel a thrumming warmth that felt oddly organic, as if something were breathing just behind the surface of the frame. "It is hungry," Thorne whispered on the final day, his voice muffled by the thicket of roots surrounding him. By the 4th year, the hole had widened to the size of a dinner plate. The edges of the hole weren't sharp, they were soft and fuzzy, like the fur of a peach. It didn't just hold heat anymore, it began to pull. When Thorne sat near it, the air seemed to lean toward the void. He noticed that the roots were no longer just growing toward his bed, they were being sucked into the hole, curling into its warmth, like noodles being pulled into a pot of boiling water. The growth was relentless. The roots became heavy, structural pillars of pale wood, turning the submersible into a hollowed-out ribcage. Thorne could no longer move much. He was woven into the very architecture of his sleep. He spent his days watching the hole expand. It grew to the size of a human torso, and the heat began to intensify until it felt like a furnace in the center of the cabin. The texture of the hole changed. It stopped being smooth. It became pitted with tiny, glowing pores that wept a faint, golden resin. It was no longer just a gap, it was a mouth without teeth. It didn't make a sound, but Thorne felt its presence as a physical weight. It felt like a heavy gaze pressing against his chest. In the final month, the roots had almost entirely swallowed the interior of the submersible, leaving only enough room for Thorne to lie in the center. The hole was now massive, occupying nearly half the cabin's width. It pulsed with a rhythmic heat that synchronized with Thorne's own heartbeat. He realized then that the family in the photograph wasn't just being replaced by the void, they were being consumed by it. One by one, the figures of the mother and children had been pulled into the hole, leaving only their silhouettes as ghosts on the edges. Then came the morning of the final day. The hole reached out. It didn't wait for Thorne to move toward it. Instead, a soft, velvet-like rim of heat extended from the center of the frame, stretching across the remaining space like an reaching hand. It touched his forehead first, then his chin, then his chest. He felt himself being pulled forward, not by gravity, but by an invitation. The roots tightened their grip on his body, holding him steady as he was drawn into the golden, warm expanse of the puncture. He didn't feel a sense of falling, he felt a sense of being folded. When the rescue team finally pried open the hatch of the submersible 3 years later, they found no bones and no wreckage. They found only the frame of the photograph, hanging perfectly still in the center of the cabin. The roots had turned to white stone, frozen in their reach. The hole was now large enough to swallow a manhole, its surface perfectly smooth and glowing with a lingering amber warmth. And there, at the very bottom of the void, were the faint indentations of a face that wasn't quite a face anymore. It is a beautiful piece, but I suggest you do not place it on a table where you might forget to look away. The guest in the margin. I am currently translating a manuscript that refuses to be finished. It is an old, leather-bound collection of poems, but as I sit in this open house, a sprawling Victorian manor I'm staging alone for the weekend, the words seem to shift whenever I stop looking at them. The light is failing now, turning the mahogany furniture into silhouettes and stretching my own shadow across the floorboards like a stain. There is a strange weight to the silence here. It isn't the absence of sound, it is the presence of an expectation. As I move through the rooms, setting out vases of lilies and smoothing the linens, I feel as though the house is holding its breath, waiting for me to acknowledge something that hasn't quite arrived yet. I found the first note on page 42. It wasn't written in ink, but rather pressed into the paper by a heavy weight. It reads, "The mourner is here." I looked up, expecting a person to be standing in the corner of the room, but there was only me and the fading amber glow of the lamps. However, as the shadows deepened, I noticed something peculiar about the way the dust motes moved. They weren't drifting. They were orbiting an empty chair by the fireplace. I began to read further into the manuscript, and the notes became more frantic. The author describes a funeral held a century ago for a man who owned this very house. No one remembered him. There was no family to weep, no friends to share stories. Yet, according to the text, there was always one person in the back row of the gallery, a mourner whose name was never recorded, whose face was never drawn. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the house felt crowded. I began to hear it, a sound like a page turning, but muffled by velvet. It wasn't a footstep sound. It was a rhythmic vibration in the air. Each time I blinked, the room seemed to reorganize itself slightly. The chair moved an inch closer to the hearth. A vase of lilies shifted from the mantel to the side table. Then I saw it. It wasn't a solid creature of flesh and bone. It was a glitch in the physical world. Imagine a film reel where two frames are slightly out of sync. That is what the mourner looks like. It is a shape made of the flicker between before and after. It possesses no fixed edges. Instead, its body consists of overlapping ripples, a constant shimmer of motion. One moment it is a seated curve, the next it is a jagged spike of movement. It doesn't have a face so much as a shifting geometry of light and shadow that suggests a profile. It moved toward me with the grace of a skipping record. It didn't walk, it blurred across the floor in pulses. Each time it pulsed, it occupied two places at once, leaving a trail of afterimages behind it like a trailing comet. I sat on the rug, my breath hitching in my chest. "Who are you?" I whispered to the empty air. The mourner responded not with a voice, but by vibrating against the silence. It moved into the space directly in front of me. Up close, its texture was like oil on water, constantly undulating. Its head flickered between a rounded sphere and a sharp, pointed shard. It didn't have eyes to see me, but it had an intensity that felt like being watched by 1,000 memories at once. I realized then why the manuscript wouldn't let itself be finished. The mourner wasn't just visiting, it was consuming the narrative. Every time I tried to write the final line of the poem, the mourner would flicker and the ink would smudge as if a heavy hand had pressed down on the page. It was mourning the fact that there was no one left to remember its name, so it had claimed the house, the manuscript, and now my attention. I reached out my hand to touch it. As my fingers brushed its surface, I felt a strange sensation, not heat or cold, but a sense of motion. My hand didn't just touch a surface, it felt as though it were being pulled into a different speed of time. The mourner expanded, its flickers becoming faster, turning the room into a dizzying kaleidoscope of light. Finally, it stopped, shimmering. It became still, holding its shape with a desperate, rigid clarity. For a heartbeat, the house was perfectly silent, and I could see the entity clearly, a beautiful, jagged crown of ripples sitting in the chair, watching me with its multi-dimensional presence. I stood up to leave, but my legs felt heavy, as if I were wading through honey. I took one last look at the manuscript on the table. The final line had finally settled into place, written by the mourner's influence. He waits for the guest who never arrives. I turned toward the door, but as I reached for the handle, I felt a sudden, sharp tug at my sleeve. It wasn't a hand grabbing me, it was the mourner reaching out from its own flicker to pull me into its frame. I realized with a jolt of terror that it wasn't just a guest in the house anymore, It had finally found something to mourn besides the man who died, and now it would begin to mourn me. The rhythms of the Grub. The road ended 3 days ago, swallowed by a violent eruption of limestone and frost. I am stationed at Outpost 42, a weather station perched on a jagged ridge where the wind speaks in vowels rather than whistles. It is a solitary life, defined by the hum of barometers and the steady, rhythmic thrum of my own pulse. Or at least it was. At first, I thought the silence was absolute. Then, during the second night, I realized the station was breathing with me. I sat in the main galley, sipping lukewarm tea, when the floorboards groaned beneath a weight that wasn't quite solid. It started as a vibration in my molars, a low-frequency thrumming that matched the beat of my heart. Then came the sound, a wet, sliding friction, like silk being pulled through thick honey. I stood up and looked toward the corridor. The hallway was long, a narrow vein of timber connecting the living quarters to the observation deck. In the center of it lay the Grub. It was massive, nearly as wide as the walls themselves, its body a segmented tube of iridescent, copper-colored skin. It didn't have legs or limbs. It simply existed as a sprawling, undulating mass of muscle and slime. Its surface was covered in thousands of microscopic cilia that flickered like tiny eyelashes. It didn't move quickly. Instead, it rippled, its body contracting and expanding in a slow, peristaltic wave. On the third night, or perhaps it was the second, for time began to blur into a single, continuous loop of twilight, the Grub moved closer. I noticed something strange about my own identity. Every time I tried to think of my name, Elias, it felt like a garment that no longer fit. It felt as though the letters were stretching, warping under some invisible pressure. When I whispered Elias aloud, the sound seemed to catch in the air. The Grub responded by pulsing. Its copper skin deepened into a bruised plum color. "Are you hungry?" I whispered, though I didn't know why I asked. The Grub didn't have a mouth in the traditional sense, but its front end flared open like a blooming flower of velvet folds. It moved with a terrifying grace, dragging its heavy weight across the floor. The friction produced a sound that mimicked my own heartbeat. Thump-thump, thump-thump. It was searching for a rhythm to mirror. By the fourth night, I realized the Grub wasn't just watching me, it was courting me. Every time my heart skipped a beat, the Grub would shudder in sympathy. It was a dance of biological synchronization. The closer it moved, the more my name began to erode. Elias became El, then Eli, and finally, it felt like just a vowel hanging in the back of my throat. I realized that the entity didn't see me as a person with a history. It saw me as a metronome. It was trying to marry its existence to mine. I stayed in the center of the galley, afraid to move too quickly lest I break the tempo. The Grub began to coil around the furniture, its segments stacking like plates of armor. It reached out with its front flare, the velvet folds tasting the air near my face. "What is my name?" I asked, my voice trembling. The Grub pulsed once, a deep, resonant boom that shook the teacups on the table. It felt as though it were answering in a language of vibrations. On the final night, the boundaries between us collapsed completely. The road was gone, the weather was irrelevant, and the station was merely a shell for our shared pulse. The Grub moved into the center of the room, its copper skin glowing with a faint, bioluminescent amber light. It wrapped its thick, muscular body around my torso, not crushing me, but molding itself to the curve of my ribs. I could feel its cilia brushing against my skin, thousands of tiny tickles that felt like 1,000 tiny kisses. My heartbeat was no longer mine alone. It was joined by the Grub's heavy, liquid thrum. As it settled into my rhythm, the last piece of Elias finally crumbled away. I didn't have a name anymore because there was no distinction between the watcher and the watched. The Grub tightened its grip, its copper segments shimmering as it found the perfect cadence. I looked down at the creature's velvet folds and realized that while it had successfully claimed my rhythm, it had also begun to claim my memories, slowly replacing every thought I had with a single, repeating pulse of its own. It leaned its heavy head against my chest, and as it did, I felt it begin to hum a low note, the sound of a name it was currently carving into my soul. When the Grub finally fell still, it didn't just stop moving, it became part of my own anatomy, a permanent weight within my ribcage. I reached out to touch its side, and as my fingers sank into the copper skin, I felt a tiny, new heartbeat start to flicker deep inside its center. It wasn't my heart anymore. It was the grub's attempt to mimic the way I used to breathe before it decided to live inside me. I closed my eyes and realized that when I finally spoke again, I wouldn't be saying my name, but its own. The silence of the station returned, heavier than before, as the grub settled into a permanent slumber within my chest cavity. It stayed there, waiting for me to stop thinking about who I was so it could finish turning me into what it is. The geometry of the unseen. I am writing this from the observation deck, though I am terrified to look at the cargo hold for too long. If you are reading this, you have probably seen my predecessor's emails forwarded through dozens of hands until their original timestamps vanished into the ether. They all described the same thing, the great drought that hit the coast 3 years ago. It was a strange, selective dry spell. While our lakes turned to cracked mud and our gardens withered into dust, the plants nobody remembers planting began to thrive. Ferns sprouted from the cracks in the sidewalk overnight. Velvet-soft moss carpeted the ceilings of abandoned warehouses. Orchids bloomed from the insides of hollow logs. They were beautiful, vibrant things, but they arrived without invitation. I spent 6 months cataloging them before I realized they weren't just growing, they were invading our space, replacing everything we had intentionally nurtured with their own chaotic persistence. I was assigned to the cargo hold of the vessel Alethea to survey these volunteer plants. At 3 a.m., the ship is a cavern of metallic silence, vibrating with the low hum of the engines. I entered the hold alone with a lantern, expecting only greenery. Instead, I found the first sign of something else. Nestled between 2 towering stalks of lavender, plants that had appeared on the steel floor just hours prior, was a shape. It was roughly the size of a wardrobe, but it didn't have a name yet. When I first pointed my lantern at it, the entity was a mess of crumbling geometry. It looked like a heap of limestone blocks and porous clay, falling apart in midair as if gravity had forgotten to hold its pieces together. It lacked a face, but it possessed a distinct weight. When I stared directly at it, it felt heavy and grounded, a stuttering pile of cubes that seemed to be trying to decide what form it wanted to take. "Is anyone there?" I whispered. As soon as the words left my lips, I blinked. For a fraction of a second, my gaze drifted to the side. The moment my focus wavered, the entity reacted. It didn't just move, it sharpened. The crumbling blocks fused instantly into a series of razor-edged planes. It became a jagged, crystalline shard of movement that sliced through the air. I froze. I realized then that this thing lived in the transition between my glances. When I looked at it, it was soft and broken. When I looked away, it was fierce and lethal. It was a creature of the periphery. I began to walk deeper into the hold. The volunteer plants were everywhere now, their stems thick as ropes. They seemed to be reacting to the entity's presence, leaning inward like spectators at a theater. Every time I turned my head, the sound of sharpening echoed, a metallic rasp, like a knife sliding over stone. I tried to keep my eyes locked on the shape to keep it from becoming too sharp. It was exhausting. My neck muscles began to ache as I fought to maintain a steady stare. "Stay soft," I commanded. The entity obeyed. It settled back into its heap of crumbling limestone, glowing with a faint, amber luminescence. But the closer I got, the more the plants began to change. They weren't just growing anymore. They were being consumed. The lavender stalks were being sliced by the sheer proximity of the entity's sharp edges when it wasn't being watched. A nearby fern was bisected into perfect, geometric triangles. Then the sensation of movement changed. I felt a draft, not from the wind, but from something shifting behind me. The entity was moving while my eyes were shut. It was traveling across the floor, navigating the labyrinth of plants with deliberate purpose. When I opened my eyes again, it was 5 feet closer. I took a deep breath and focused on its center. It was a heap of beautiful, dusty cubes. "Don't move," I breathed. It stayed still. But as I held the gaze, I noticed the blocks were beginning to rotate in place, like gears in a clock. The smell changed from damp earth to the scent of ozone and hot flint. It was preparing for something. Then I heard it. a sound that shouldn't exist in a cargo hold. It was a wet, grinding noise, as if the entity were chewing on the silence itself. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to look away, but I fought it. If I blinked, it would sharpen. If it sharpened, it might strike. I held my gaze for 10 seconds of pure, agonizing concentration. The blocks were perfectly still, glowing with that warm amber light. It was peaceful. It was almost beautiful. Then, the floor beneath me groaned. A vine of volunteer plant whipped upward, curling around my ankle like a seeking hand. In that moment, I lost my focus. My eyelids flickered. I felt the air pressure change instantly. The sharp shing of the entity's transformation was so sudden it felt like a physical blow to my ears. It didn't just become sharp, it became elongated and needle-like, its edges spinning with such velocity that they hummed. I couldn't see it clearly, it was moving too fast for my brain to process, but I could feel the heat of its blades. It swept through the air in a crescent arc. It didn't cut the plants, it sliced them into dust. I scrambled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. The entity settled again into its crumbling block form, but it was closer now, nearly touching my chest. I stared at it one last time, trying to memorize every crack and crevice of its limestone face. It was perfectly still, a heap of gentle ruins. I felt a strange sense of kinship with it. It was waiting for me to look away so it could finally finish what it started. I took a final breath, closed my eyes for the count of 3, and then snapped them open wide. The entity was no longer in front of me. It had become a single, towering spire of blades, standing perfectly still at the far end of the hold, pointed directly at my throat. The Cartographer of the In-Between. I am currently writing this from a hard plastic chair that smells faintly of industrial wax and old rain. If you are reading this, it means I have finally stopped moving, which is more than can be said for the last 3 hours. I sat down in this bus depot at 3:58 a.m. to wait for the 4:12 express, but the schedule was smudged by moisture and time seemed to stretch like warm taffy. The room was mostly empty, save for a large map of our neighborhood pinned to the far wall. It was a sprawling thing of ink and parchment, showing every alleyway we know. Or, at least, that is what I thought it was when I first sat down. I closed my eyes for a minute. When I opened them, the map had changed. The main boulevard curved into an elegant spiral. A new cul-de-sac sprouted where the garden used to be. It didn't just change, it breathed. The ink moved like tiny insects crawling across the page. I blinked again. The spiral straightened into a jagged zigzag. By the 3rd time I looked up, our street names were being replaced by symbols, circles with dots, wavy lines like frozen ripples, and geometric shapes that hadn't been there before. Then came the sound, a rhythmic, heavy scraping against the floorboards. It wasn't a footfall. It sounded like wood sliding over stone. From behind a row of rusted benches, it emerged. It was not a ghost, nor was it quite a man. It was a creature assembled from the furniture of this depot. Its torso was a plush, velvet-upholstered armchair with a curved back, but its limbs were mismatched. One arm was a sturdy mahogany table leg, the other a delicate, bent wicker chair rib. For legs, it possessed a heavy oak stool base on the left and a spindly, wrought iron gate hinge on the right. It had no face in the traditional sense. Instead, its head was a round, glowing lantern made of brass, casting an amber light over everything it touched. The creature didn't walk so much as it balanced itself, lurching forward with a grace that defied its heavy construction. It stopped 3 feet from me. The lantern head hummed, vibrating against the velvet chest. I felt my breath hitch. "Is this your house?" the creature asked. Its voice didn't come from a mouth. It resonated from the hollow center of its armchair chest, like a cello string being plucked. It pointed a table leg finger toward the map. I looked up and gasped. The map was no longer our neighborhood. It had become a labyrinthine maze of towering towers and sunken pits, drawn in deep indigo ink. "No," I whispered, my voice cracking in the silence. "It used to be home." The creature moved closer, its wicker rib arm reaching out to stroke the parchment. As it touched a spot near the center, the map rippled like a pond hit by a pebble. A new street appeared along, straight line that looked suspiciously like the path I had walked into the depot just moments before. It is becoming what you think of while you sleep, the creature explained. The light from its lantern head pulsed. I am the weaver of the waking dream. Every time your eyelids heavy, a new street is born. Every time you dream of a door, I draw a hallway. Every time you fear a corner, I carve out a shadow. The creature began to circle me, its legs making different sounds: thump, click, scrape, thump. With every revolution, the map grew more complex. The street spiraled inward toward a single point in the middle of the parchment. Why did it change so much? I asked, my heart hammering. The creature paused, its lantern dimming before brightening again. Because you are not just watching it. You are imagining it. The map is your memory, reorganized by the weight of your thoughts. I reached out to touch the velvet of its torso. As my fingers brushed the fabric, the map suddenly jerked. A massive forest appeared on the right side, its trees drawn with such detail I could almost smell the pine. Then, a sudden shudder ran through the room. The walls of the depot seemed to lean inward, as if the building itself were reacting to the map's expansion. The creature stood tall, its wicker arm lifting high. The final street is forming, it announced. On the wall, a single, wide road began to stretch from the bottom of the map all the way to the top. It was a winding path that looked like a reaching hand. At the very end of this road, a tiny, perfect house appeared. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of vertigo. The depot began to fade at the edges, the ceiling disappearing into a mist of ink. I realized then that we weren't just in a waiting room anymore. The map was swallowing the room, pulling the reality of the depot into its paper borders. The creature leaned down, its lantern head inches from my face. The warmth of the light felt like a physical weight on my skin. You are no longer waiting for the bus, it said softly. You are traveling along the path you just drew. I looked at the map one last time. The ink was still wet, glistening under the amber glow. The house at the end of the road had a tiny door, and beside it, a small figure sat on the porch, waving. It was a perfect likeness of me, though it was made entirely of ink. The room fell silent as the last of the depot vanished, leaving only the map and the creature standing in a vast, white void. I realized with a jolt that there were no more chairs left to sit on, even they had been pulled into the parchment. I looked down at my own hands and saw they were beginning to turn a deep, permanent indigo. The creature hummed one last time, its lantern flickering out as it settled onto the floor, turning back into a pile of mismatched wood and velvet. I closed my eyes, feeling the paper beneath my feet. I know that when I open them, there will be no depot left, only the street I imagined in the dark. The house at the end of the road is waiting for me to walk through the door. The Syllable of the Subterranean. Logbook A, Day 1. The renovation of the ranch house has reached the foundation. We broke through 3 feet of limestone and discovered a cavernous hollow, a fallout shelter from the late 50s, perfectly preserved. It smells of ozone and old wax. It feels heavy, as if the earth is pressing down on it with intent. I spent today clearing out the dust. The silence down there is thick, almost tangible. Logbook B, Day 4. The first night in the shelter was unsettling. There is a peculiar acoustics to the room. A whisper at one end echoes like a shout at the other. I found a small bird, a sparrow, trapped in the corner. It chirped incessantly until it fell asleep. Then, something happened. A sound came from the darkness beyond the torchlight. It was a voice, low and resonant. Elias. It didn't just say my name. It stretched the first syllable like taffy. I froze. The sparrow, which had been sleeping, suddenly sat bolt upright, its tiny beak clicking shut as if waiting for a blow. Logbook A, Day 12. We moved the heavy mahogany table into the center of the vault. It feels like a sanctuary, yet every time we leave the room, the air feels occupied. I found a second bird yesterday, a robin. It was hopping across the floor when the voice spoke again from the far corner where my light didn't reach. Liazi, the stress shifted to the middle. The robin stopped mid-hop, its wings locking against its sides. It became perfectly still, as if holding its breath. Logbook B, Day 18. The entity is becoming more frequent. It isn't just a voice, it's a presence that feels like velvet rubbing against skin. It doesn't have a body I can see clearly yet, but it has texture. It sounds like wet moss scraping against stone. It spoke 3 times today, Elias, Liazi, and Elias. Each time, the animals reacted with the same eerie synchronization. My dog, Barnaby, who usually loves to bark at every shadow, now sits in the center of the room. When the voice speaks, he becomes a statue. He doesn't even twitch his tail. Logbook A, Day 24. I spent 4 hours mapping the walls. There are carvings along the perimeter, strange, rhythmic grooves that look like fingerprints, but are much larger. The air is getting colder. The entity seems to be moving closer every night. It no longer stays in the corners. It drifts toward my chair while I work. Last night, it whispered Elias right against my ear. I felt a sensation of something heavy and soft brushing my shoulder, not a hand, but something like a broad, smooth leaf of skin. Logbook B, Day 30. The tension is peaking. The silence between the voices' utterances is different now. It isn't just quiet, it is a suspended state. Every time I turn my head to find the source, the voice pauses. It is waiting for me to look. The sparrow from Day 4 has lived a long time in this vault. It survives on crumbs and water, but its behavior is haunting. It never sings anymore. It only waits. Logbook A, Day 35. I realized today that the entity isn't just repeating my name, it's trying to find the correct way to say it. It is experimenting with my identity. Yesterday, it tried Asli. The robin didn't move until the very last second of the word, then its head snapped toward the ceiling. I can feel it watching me even when I close my eyes. There is a weight in the air like being underwater. Logbook B, Day 40. I woke up at 3 a.m. to find the vault bathed in a dim, amber glow that didn't come from my lamp. The entity was standing 3 feet away. It has no face in the traditional sense, just a vast expanse of rippling, iridescent scales like those on a dragonfly's wing, and a singular, wide slit for a mouth. It doesn't have eyes to blink. It spoke, Elias. For the first time, it hit every syllable with perfect balance. The sparrow, the robin, and Barnaby all stood in a perfect line, facing the creature, their bodies trembling with a tiny, rhythmic vibration. Logbook A, Day 45. I am terrified to move too quickly now. Every movement feels like an intrusion. If I reach for a tool or a piece of bread, the entity reacts by changing its texture from smooth scales to something that feels like crushed velvet. It is learning my habits. It mimics the way I breathe. It mimics the rhythm of my heartbeat. Logbook B, Day 50. The climax came today. I was sitting at the table, writing in this very book, when the silence became absolute. Even my own breathing seemed to stop for a moment. From the darkness above me, the entity descended. It didn't walk, it drifted like a puff of smoke. Its mouth opened, a deep, violet cavern. It spoke, Elias. The syllables were perfect. Every bird in the vault froze. Barnaby's ears stood straight up, but he didn't bark. The robin stayed suspended in midair for a fraction of a second before landing on my thumb. Logbook A, Day 52. It is over now. The entity has finished its rehearsal. It no longer needs to experiment with the stresses of my name. It knows exactly who I am. Yesterday, it stopped speaking altogether and simply hummed, a low, vibrating note that made the dust on the floor dance in geometric patterns. Logbook B, Day 55. Today, the entity didn't wait for me to move. It moved with me. When I stood up to leave the vault, it stayed glued to my shadow, a heavy weight trailing behind my heels. I realized that the reason the animals went silent wasn't just because they heard the voice. They were reacting to its hunger. The hush is the moment of recognition, the second before it decides to take what it wants. I sat in the center of the room and closed my eyes, feeling its presence press against my back like a warm, wet stone. I felt its mouth open near my neck, the violet cavern stretching wide. It didn't speak this time. It simply exhaled a breath that smelled of old rain and crushed mint. I finally understood why the animals go still. They aren't just listening to the name. They are mourning the person who is about to be swallowed by it. The entity leaned in, its velvet scale skin brushing my cheek, and whispered one final, perfectly stressed syllable that wasn't mine at all. It said US. The Knuckle-Walker of the low tide. In this town, we do not speak of things as they are. We speak of them by how they make us feel, for truth is often too heavy to carry alone. To understand my life on the lighthouse island, you must first learn our vocabulary. For instance, the solitude is what we call the silence that hums. It is not an absence of sound, but a presence of weight. The vigil is the act of watching the horizon until your eyes ache with the memory of light. And then there is the stream. I moved to the lighthouse because I wanted to be alone with the vigil. It was supposed to be a simple life. Salt on my skin, the rhythmic pulse of the lantern, and the vast expanse of the sea. But then, 3 months ago, I found the perspective. This is what we call an angle that shouldn't exist. It began when I set up a small camera in my sleeping chamber. It wasn't positioned to face me from the front, nor from the side. Instead, it was placed at a sharp, impossible diagonal, capturing my bed, my desk, and the far corner of the ceiling simultaneously, yet, when I watched the live stream on my tablet, the perspective felt inverted. Objects in the background seemed closer than those in the foreground, and the depth of the room stretched outward like a piece of fabric being pulled from its center. It was a view that defied the geometry of the stone walls. For the first week, the stream showed only me. I would wake up, move about my chores, and watch myself on the small screen. But during the second week, the glitch appeared. This is the word we use for the moment reality stutters. I was sitting at my desk, drinking tea, when a shape flickered in the corner of the live stream. It wasn't there when I turned my head to look. In the stream, however, it remained. It looked like a smudge of charcoal against the white plaster. Every time I blinked in real life, the smudge stayed perfectly still on the screen. By the third week, the guest arrived. This is our word for the thing that occupies the space between here and now. It began to appear more frequently in the stream, though it remained invisible to my naked eyes. At first, it was just a movement, a slight ripple in the air near the ceiling. Then I saw its limbs. It did not have traditional hands or feet. It moved on knuckles. These were not small joints. They were massive, bulbous protrusions of bone and hide that looked like smooth river stones fused to a frame. Each knuckle was roughly the size of a grapefruit, covered in a skin as tough as rhinoceros hide and dappled with irregular, copper-colored spots. Because the knuckles were so large, the actual palms beneath them seemed almost vestigial, small velvet pads that barely touched the ground. I began to stay up late, watching the stream instead of the sea. The guest moved with a peculiar rolling gait. It didn't walk. It tumbled forward on its knuckles, each massive joint striking the floor with a muffled thrum. In the live stream, I could see it move across the room while I sat perfectly still in my chair. It would reach out a heavy knuckle and tap against the wall, creating a ripple in the shadows that only the camera caught. Why can you not be seen? I whispered to the empty air one night. In the stream, the guest responded by moving closer to the lens. Its knuckles were so large they almost blocked out my bed. It moved with a deliberate, rhythmic grace, its body swaying like a heavy pendulum. Then came the convergence. This is the moment where the hidden becomes manifest. It happened on a Tuesday, during a storm that turned the sky the color of a bruised plum. I was lying in bed, my eyes closed, listening to the wind howl against the lighthouse glass. I felt nothing but the damp chill of the salt air. But on my bedside table, the tablet was glowing. I opened my eyes and looked at the screen. The guest was no longer in the corner. It was standing directly over me. In the live stream, its massive knuckles were inches from my face, one of them resting on the pillow where my head lay. I could see the copper spots clearly, the texture of the skin looking like parched earth. Then I felt it. A weight settled onto my chest. A cool, dry pressure pressed against my ribs. The room was still empty to my eyes, the walls were bare, the chair was vacant, but in the stream, the guest was looming over me, its massive knuckles supporting its heavy, unseen bulk. I held my breath, terrified to move, afraid that a single twitch would break the spell of the impossible angle. I watched the screen as it leaned forward. Its copper-spotted knuckles shifted slightly, and for a second, the thrum echoed in the room, though there was nothing to strike the floor. I reached out my hand, trembling, trying to touch what I could not see. My fingers met something solid and warm, a knuckle as large as a melon, smooth as a polished stone. It wasn't just watching me from the screen. It had finally stepped into the perspective of my world. I sat up abruptly, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the corner where the stream showed its face, and for a split second, reality caught up with the camera. The air shimmered, and a shape appeared, a heavy, knuckled limb reaching out from the void. It didn't vanish. It stayed there, half solid, a bridge between the two worlds. I watched as it pulled back, retreating into the shadows of the ceiling. The stream showed it moving away, its massive knuckles rolling along the plaster like marbles. I lay back down, my breath coming in short bursts. I realized then that the perspective wasn't just a way to see the room. It was a doorway. The guest hadn't been hiding in the corner of the room. It had been hiding in the angle itself. It lived in the space between what we see and what is there. I closed my eyes and let out a long, shaky exhale, finally allowing myself to sleep. But as I drifted off, I felt one last movement, a single, heavy knuckle tapping against the side of my head from the exact spot where the camera showed it to be. The Lag of the Velvet Throne. Draft 1. To anyone who finds this log, please ignore the humming. It isn't a machine. The permafrost drill is steady at 300 meters, but there is a low, vibrating thrum that seems to come from the floorboards of the mess hall. It feels like the ground itself is purring. We're under the midnight sun, so the light never truly dies. It just stretches into a bruised purple haze. I am sitting in the corner, watching the shadow of the drill tower lengthen against the ice. There is a chair there, a heavy, velvet-upholstered thing we hauled from the surface. It looks comfortable, but it feels heavier than it should. Every time I look at it, I feel like something is about to sit down in it. Draft 2. I finally sat in it today. The velvet felt thick and slightly damp, as if it had been drinking the subterranean humidity. It was a deep, wine-red color that seemed to swallow the dim light of our lanterns. When I sat, the chair groaned under my weight, but then something strange happened. I looked at my own reflection in the polished copper kettle across from me. As I reached out to touch the rim of my mug, my reflection followed perfectly. But as I pulled my hand back, the reflection's hand lingered for a heartbeat longer before snapping into place. It was a minuscule delay, a tiny stutter in reality. I dismissed it as exhaustion. Draft 3. The lag is becoming more distinct. It isn't just my hands anymore. This morning, I blinked, and for a fraction of a second, the reflection remained with its eyes wide open before closing them to match mine. It's like the image in the copper kettle is trying to catch up to me. But it's not the kettle that's the problem, it's the chair. When I stood up from the velvet throne, the indentation of my body stayed there for 3 seconds before flattening out. Even though no one was sitting there, the fabric held the shape of a slumped shoulder and a curved spine. It felt as if the chair was remembering me. Draft 4. Something is occupying the seat when I am not. I walked into the mess hall this afternoon to find the velvet red sagging in the middle. There were no people there, yet the fabric rippled as if something heavy had just shifted its weight. It felt warm, not the warmth of a radiator, but the radiating heat of a living body. I touched the spot where a head should be and felt a faint pulse against my palm. It was smooth and slightly tacky, like skin that had been left in the sun for too long. When I pulled my hand away, the shape vanished instantly, leaving the chair perfectly flat. Draft 5. The lag is worsening. It's no longer a heartbeat of a delay. It's a full second. Yesterday, I waved my hand to signal the cook, and my reflection didn't move until I had already finished the gesture. It felt like watching a slow-motion replay of my own life. And the chair is starting to move on its own. While I was eating my soup, I saw the velvet bulge outward as if someone were leaning forward. Then, a split second later, it collapsed back into a neutral position. It's as if whatever sits there is moving in slow motion, or perhaps it's just taking its time to arrive. Draft 6. I can hear it now. Not a sound of movement, but the sound of displacement. A soft thump followed by a long, lingering shhh as air rushes into the space where the occupant was. The entity in the chair is becoming more defined. It doesn't have a face yet, just a suggestion of one, a rounded protrusion of velvet that feels like a forehead. When I walk past it, I feel a sudden draft of heat on my cheek. I stopped today and stared at it for a full minute. The shape in the chair moved. A small ridge of fabric shifted to the left, then stayed there. It didn't move because I told it to. It moved because it was finished with its turn. Draft 7. We are all starting to notice the lagging guest. The crew is terrified to sit in the chair anymore because they don't want to share the space. Today, I sat in it and felt a strange sensation, a resistance. It felt like sitting on a mattress that was already occupied by something soft and slightly firm. As I leaned back, my reflection in the kettle finally moved to match me, but only after I had almost finished my exhale. The entity is getting faster. It's no longer lagging behind. It's starting to anticipate. Draft 8. The anticipation is eerie. This morning, I reached for a spoon and felt the chair's shape lean toward my hand before I even moved. Then, when I finally grasped the silver handle, the reflection in the kettle moved before I did. It was as if the image of me was trying to jump ahead into the future. But the entity in the chair is still catching up. When I stood up quickly, the velvet shape remained for a full 5 seconds, slowly melting away like wax. It's no longer just a shape. It feels like a heavy, invisible weight pressing against the air. Draft 9. The midnight sun is casting long, distorted shadows today. The chair is almost fully formed now. In the center of the red velvet sits a rounded mass that looks like a slumped head and 2 broader masses that suggest shoulders. It isn't just heat anymore. It's a constant presence. When I am in the room, the shape seems to be watching me. Every time I blink, the reflection in the kettle is almost perfectly synchronized with my face now, but the chair is still struggling. When I moved my arm today, the velvet shoulder took 3 full seconds to rise and fall. It's like the entity is moving through honey. Draft 10. I stayed in the mess hall tonight after everyone else went to their bunks. The silence was heavy, broken only by the thrum of the permafrost drill. I stood perfectly still, watching the red chair. Then it happened. Without me moving a muscle, the velvet shape in the chair suddenly surged forward, its head tilting toward my chest. A second later, my reflection in the kettle mirrored the movement, even though I hadn't moved at all. The entity is finally catching up to the present moment. I realized then that it isn't just a shape of someone who was never there. It is someone who is still arriving from somewhere else. Just as I turned to leave, the chair gave one final, violent shudder and settled into a perfect flat state, leaving me with the realization that whatever sat there finally finished its journey and was now waiting for me to take my turn. The weight of the empty seat. I found the first note on the kitchen table, written in my own shaky handwriting. "Don't mind the silence yet," it said. I didn't know then that I was leaving a trail for someone who wasn't there. The service corridor beneath the convention center is a labyrinth of concrete and humming pipes, a subterranean artery where thousands of people walk above while the world below remains still. I went down there to fix a flickering light, but the atmosphere felt heavy, as if the air itself were holding its breath. As I stepped into the first stretch of hallway, I noticed the strange behavior of the streetlights. They didn't just glow, they behaved like dying embers of thought. Every time I took a step forward, the light behind me died instantly, plunging into total darkness, while the one ahead remained bright enough to reveal the path, but not the destination. The silence wasn't empty. It felt thick, like water pressing against my eardrums. I walked for 10 minutes, my footsteps echoing in a rhythmic thrum that seemed to pull at my chest. Then I found the second note stuck to a pillar, written in a much tighter, more urgent script. It follows the light, but it prefers the shadow. I stopped. The air didn't just cool, it curdled. A localized bloom of warmth erupted from the darkness ahead, a wet, humid heat that smelled of toasted oats and old paper. From around the next bend came the entity. It wasn't a solid creature of flesh and bone, but a shimmering, amber-hued outline, a glowing silhouette that looked as if it were made of woven silk and honey. Most strikingly, it held the perfect physical impression of whoever had sat in its chair last. Because I was the last person to have sat on the heavy wooden stool at the corridor's entrance, the entity took my shape, but with a peculiar texture. Its surface rippled like water, and it possessed 3 distinct horns protruding from its crown, each curling slightly inward. My pulse hammered against my ribs as it drifted closer. It didn't have eyes or a mouth. Instead, it had a surface of moving geometric patterns that shifted with a frantic, hungry energy. I found the 3rd note taped to my own belt loop, written in a messy, sprawling hand. It remembers your posture. The entity wasn't just following me, it was mimicking the way I carried my shoulders. It moved with a slight delay, a ghost of movement that felt like watching a replay of my own life. The corridor began to narrow, the ceiling dipping lower as if the building were trying to squeeze me into a smaller space. I reached a wide junction where 3 paths diverged. I hesitated, and the lights flickered in confusion. I found the 4th note on the floor, written in tiny, cramped letters. The light is its fuel. The shadow is its home. I chose the left path, but as I moved, the entity didn't just follow, it began to stretch. It lost its human-like shape and became a long, flowing ribbon of amber light that draped over the pillars like a glowing curtain. The warmth was almost suffocating now, a humid embrace that felt like being wrapped in a heated blanket. I started to jog, my breath coming in short gasps. The lights behind me were snapping off so quickly they sounded like tiny pops of glass breaking. Halfway down the long stretch, I found the 5th note pinned to a hanging pipe. It is hungry for your stillness. I slowed my pace, realizing that the entity was reacting to my speed. When I ran, it elongated. When I slowed, it condensed back into that 3-horned, human shape. It was perfectly mimicking my posture again, even leaning slightly forward as if about to dive into the ground. The corridor felt like it was shrinking. The walls seemed closer now, and the ceiling hummed with a low, vibrating frequency that made my teeth ache. I reached a dead end where a single chair stood alone in a pool of light. I found the 6th note on the seat. Sit down. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew that if I sat, I would become the next person to leave an impression. The entity moved into my personal space, its amber glow illuminating every crack in the concrete. It hovered just inches from my face, the geometric patterns on its surface spinning rapidly like a kaleidoscope. I took a deep breath and lowered myself onto the chair. As my weight hit the wood, I felt a strange sensation, a slight tug at my spine, as if something were pulling me into the seat. The 7th note appeared, floating in the air just before my eyes. Now you are part of the memory. I sat perfectly still. The entity didn't move away. It merged with me. It wrapped around my shoulders like a cloak of glowing silk, its amber light soaking into my skin. For a moment, I could feel its texture, the soft, hummed vibration of its surface. Then, the lights ahead of me began to dim one by one until only the chair and I were left in a sphere of gold. I found the 8th note on my own lap. The next person will see you. I closed my eyes. The warmth was no longer coming from the entity. It felt like it was radiating from my own bones. I could feel myself becoming less solid, my edges blurring into the shape of a silhouette. The walls seemed to fade away, leaving only the sensation of the chair and the hum of the pipes. The 9th note appeared on the wall opposite me, written in a hand that looked almost like my own. Wait for the light to find you. I realized then that I wasn't just watching the entity, it was waiting for me to become its next vessel. The corridor began to feel less like a hallway and more like a gallery of memories. I felt my body start to flatten, becoming an outline rather than a mass of muscle and bone. Finally, I found the 10th note on the very last inch of the chair's armrest. Don't move. I stopped breathing, trying to hold my shape against the inevitable. The amber light pulsed once, twice, and then settled into a steady glow. My skin began to shimmer with that same honey-like texture, and I felt the 3 horns sprout from my forehead, curving inward. The corridor grew silent as the last streetlight behind me vanished completely. I am no longer the traveler. I am the shape left behind in the chair. When the next person walks down this hall, they will see my amber outline, feeling the warmth of my posture, and for a fleeting second, they will feel the ghost of my weight still pressing into the wood. I found the 1st note on the kitchen table, written in my own shaky handwriting. Don't mind the silence yet, it said. The margin of the twins. The salt air was thick enough to taste, a briny coating on my tongue as I sat on the creaking floorboards of the oyster shack. It was stranded by the low tide, its wooden stilts sinking into the wet silt like the legs of a weary heron. Outside, the rhythmic slap of retreating water against timber provided the only soundtrack to my solitude. In my lap lay a second-hand copy of The History of Celestial Navigation, its leather cover cracked and smelling of old dust and sea spray. I had found it in a coastal junk shop, but it was the margin notes that had caught my attention. Someone had spent years annotating every page with a fluid, sloping script. At first, the notes were simple observations. The stars are lonely tonight, or a good day for a voyage. But as I progressed, the handwriting began to change character. It became more frantic, more deliberate. By the middle of the book, the words started to double up, and the owner had begun to address an unseen companion. It likes the blue ones. One note read near a diagram of the North Star. Then, on the opposite side of the same page, but I prefer the gold. I flipped the page, my thumb lingering on the edge. The handwriting was identical in both entries, the same looped L, the same sharp flick of the T at the end of a sentence. It felt like a conversation between two people who shared the exact same personality, yet lived in different minds. As I sat in the shack, watching a lone crab scuttle across the mud, I noticed a new note appearing on page 84 that hadn't been there when I first opened the book. It was fresh, the ink still slightly moist. "He is watching from the corner," it read. I looked up. The shack was empty save for me and my chair. A faint chill swept through the room, despite the afternoon sun. On the next page, a new line appeared as if an invisible pen were moving across the paper. "He is hungry." My heart gave a small thump. I reached out to touch the ink, but my hand hovered just above the surface. The handwriting was mine, or rather, it was a perfect mimicry of my own style. It had my signature slant, my messy curves. But I hadn't written those words yet. I turned the page again. The next note read, "You are sitting too still." I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. Was it possible for a book to react to its reader in real time? Or was there something inside the pages, a stowaway of ink and intent? I began to read faster, searching for the source. The notes started to pile up, appearing in clusters. "Do you hear the water?" "I hear it. And do you see me?" "Not yet." The handwriting was perfectly synchronized. It felt as though two versions of my own hand were reaching out from the paper to meet one another. The me that wrote the first line and the me that answered it were distinct, yet inseparable. I started to feel a strange pressure in the air, a sense of being observed by something just behind my shoulder. I began to scribble my own notes in the margins, trying to join the conversation. "Who are you?" I wrote at the bottom of page 90. There was a pause. The silence of the shack felt heavy, as if the air were holding its breath. Then, a response blossomed on the opposite margin. The twin. I frowned. A twin? I had only ever seen one set of handwriting. Now, the page seemed to vibrate with the presence of two. "Which twin?" I asked, my pen hovering over the paper. On the next turn of the page, a new line appeared in a bold, sweeping motion. "The one who stays." I felt a sudden, sharp sensation of movement from the corner of the shack. A shadow shifted, but there was no source for it. It wasn't a ghost or a creature I could see clearly. It was a distortion in the light, like a ripple in water. It moved toward my chair, gliding across the floorboards with a soft, rhythmic clicking sound. I looked back at the book. The notes were becoming frantic now, appearing in rapid succession. "He is closer." The salt smells of old paper. "Is it your turn?" I gripped the edges of the book. The twin was no longer just a mark on a page. It felt like a physical presence pressing against my skin. I could feel a faint warmth radiating from the spine of the book, and the scent of wet ink began to fill my nostrils. Finally, I reached the very last page. It was nearly blank, except for a single line at the top. "The first one is tired." Below it, in a sprawling, jagged script that seemed to overflow the margins until it touched the edges of the paper, was the final note. "The second one has arrived." I felt a cold puff of air hit my ear. I didn't turn around immediately. I watched as a smudge of wet ink began to seep out from the bottom of the page, dripping onto my thumb like a bead of sweat. Then I saw it. A hand not made of flesh, but made of shimmering, liquid ink reached out from the binding of the book. It didn't have skin. It had texture like a watercolor painting. Its shape was fluid, constantly shifting as if it were still being written by an unseen artist. It gripped my wrist with a grip that felt firm and slightly damp. I finally turned my head to look at the space just above the book. There, hovering in the air, was a face formed from flowing script. It had no nose or ears, but its mouth was a wide, curving curve of letters, and its eyes were two perfect, ink-filled ovals. "Which of us is real?" it asked, its voice sounding like the rustle of parchment being unfolded. I looked at my own hand, then at its ink-stained fingers. I thought of the notes, the way they had shared the same curves and loops, yet lived in different places on the page. "You are both real," I whispered. The entity smiled, its scripty mouth widening. It leaned in closer, its ink scent overpowering the smell of salt. "Yes," it murmured, "but you are the one who will be written into the next page." It reached out and touched my forehead with a finger that left a permanent stain of black ink on my skin. The shack fell silent as the tide began to turn, the water rushing back in to claim the stilts. I felt myself becoming heavy, my limbs feeling stiff and two-dimensional as if they were being flattened against the floor. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I felt my thoughts turning into loops and flicks, my memories settling into the grooves of the paper. When I finally looked down at my hand again, it was no longer flesh. It was a series of beautiful, looping letters that would never move again. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories, and make sure to like.